September 26, 1918. The Argonne Forest, France. General John Pershing stood at his headquarters and looked at the maps that showed the most ambitious American military operation in history and understood with complete clarity what the next 6 weeks were going to cost. 1.2 million American soldiers. A 47-mile front stretching from the Meuse River on the east to the Argonne Forest on the west. The objective was the Sedan-Mézières railway, the main supply line that fed the entire German Western Front. Cut it and the German army in France and Belgium could not be supplied. The German army could not fight without supply. The war would end. It was the right strategy. Pershing had been arguing for exactly this kind of decisive blow rather than the grinding attrition that the British and French commands had been conducting since 1914. The American army that had been building in France since 1917 had reached the size where it could deliver that blow. The problem was that the American army that was about to attempt the most important offensive operation of the First World War had existed in its current form for approximately 18 months. The soldiers who were going to attack through the Argonne Forest had been civilians in the United States less than 2 years earlier. Their officers had been trained in schools that had been built or expanded to meet a wartime demand that no one had anticipated before April 1917. Their logistics, their artillery coordination, their communications, their staff work were all being tested for the first time in conditions that the most experienced armies in the world had spent 4 years learning to manage. They were going to attack anyway. The Argonne Forest that was one half of the offensive's frontage was terrain that the German army had had 4 years to fortify. The forest was ancient and dense, its trees hundreds of years old, its undergrowth thick enough to reduce visibility to a few meters in any direction, its ravines and ridgelines covered with defensive positions that the German engineers had built with the thoroughness of men who understood that the forest was the key terrain on that part of the front. The defensive positions in the Argonne were not the improvised trenches of 1914. They were mature systems that had been improved continuously for 4 years, concrete bunkers that could survive direct artillery hits, machine gun positions that covered every trail and every clearing and every approach route, wire obstacles that channeled attackers into pre-registered kill zones, artillery batteries positioned to provide support throughout the defensive depth. Against this, the American First Army sent soldiers who had been farmers and factory workers and coal miners and students 18 months earlier, commanded by officers who had been learning their trade in peacetime army posts, supported by logistics and staff systems that were being built and operated simultaneously. What they had that 4 years of Western Front warfare had stripped from the British and French armies was the aggressive spirit of men who had not yet learned to be afraid of what the Western Front could do to an attacking force. They attacked. The first day of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, September 26, 1918, produced gains that the most optimistic planning had not anticipated. American infantry that had been told the advance would be measured in hundreds of meters advance miles. The German defensive positions that had been in place for 4 years were overrun by the sheer momentum of an attacking force that had not been taught to stop. Then the American force ran into the real Argonne defenses, the second and third defensive lines that the Germans had built precisely because they understood that the first line would not hold indefinitely, and the advance slowed to the grinding yard-by-yard progress that characterized every major Western Front offensive. The specific combination of inexperience and determination that defined the American army in the Meuse-Argonne produced both its worst failures and its most extraordinary individual achievements. The Lost Battalion was the worst failure. On October 2nd, approximately 550 men of the 77th Infantry Division's 1st Battalion 308th Infantry advanced further than their flanking units and found themselves surrounded and cut off in the Argonne Forest, without food or water or medical supplies, under fire from German positions on every side. The Lost Battalion held. For 6 days they held, firing back with the ammunition they had carried into the pocket, treating their wounded with whatever medical supplies they had, refusing to surrender to messages delivered under white flags by German officers who offered honorable terms. Their commanding officer, Major Charles Whittlesey, sent a message by carrier pigeon to headquarters that has become one of the most quoted communications of the American military history. The carrier pigeon that delivered his message was named Cher Ami, dear friend, and she delivered it despite being shot through the breast and blinded in one eye and having a leg nearly shot away, completing her mission because carrier pigeons do not know that they have been shot. She was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government and is preserved today at the Smithsonian Institution. Whittlesey's message read, "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The artillery stopped. The Lost Battalion held until October 8th, when relief forces finally broke through to their position. Of the 550 men who had been surrounded, 197 were still capable of walking out. The most extraordinary individual achievement of the Meuse-Argonne offensive happened on October 8th, the same day the Lost Battalion was relieved, in a ravine in the Argonne Forest near the village of Chatel-Chéhéry. Corporal Alvin York was a farmer from the mountains of Fentress County, Tennessee, a man who had grown up shooting squirrels for food in the Cumberland Mountains and who had arrived in France as one of the most naturally gifted marksmen in the American Expeditionary Forces. He had initially sought conscientious objector status on religious grounds, had been convinced by his commanding officer that the war was a just cause, and had shipped to France with the 82nd Infantry Division. On the morning of October 8th, York's patrol of 17 men had been sent around the flank of a German position that was holding up the advance. They found themselves behind the main German line and captured approximately 20 Germans who had been eating breakfast in a ravine. Then the situation changed. A larger German force on the ridge above the ravine opened fire on the patrol, killing 9 of York's 17 men, including Sergeant Harry Parsons, the patrol leader. York, now the senior non-commissioned officer, was separated from the rest of the patrol by the fire. What happened next is documented in York's diary, in the after-action reports of his regiment, in the testimonies of the German officers who were present, and in the investigation that General Pershing personally ordered to verify York's account before authorizing the Medal of Honor that the initial reporting recommended. York, alone with his rifle and his pistol against a German force that he estimated at between 20 and 30 machine gun positions on the ridge above him, began shooting. He had grown up shooting squirrels. Squirrels are small and fast, and the mountain hunters of Tennessee had developed the specific marksmanship technique of going for the headshot because a body shot would damage the meat. York applied this technique to the German soldiers on the ridge, shooting the ones furthest back in the formation first so that the ones in front would not realize what was happening until there was nobody left to tell them. When a German officer led a bayonet charge of 6 men down the ridge toward York, York shot them in reverse order of approach, from the last man to the first, so that each man fell without the men in front of him seeing what was happening. He killed all 6. A German major who was among the captured prisoners from the ravine watched what York was doing and concluded that resistance was no longer rational. He offered to order the remaining German soldiers to surrender if York would stop shooting. York accepted the offer. When Corporal Alvin York marched back into American lines with 132 German prisoners, including 4 officers, he had killed between 20 and 28 German soldiers with approximately 28 shots from his rifle and pistol. The exact count was disputed then and has been disputed since, but the lower bounds of the estimates are extraordinary enough that the dispute about the upper bounds is almost beside the point. A single American soldier from rural Tennessee had captured 132 Germans and killed an uncertain number more. Pershing's investigation confirmed the account. York received the Medal of Honor. Marshal Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, called York's action the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe. What York had done was not typical of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and it was not representative of what most American soldiers experienced in the 47 days of the campaign. Most of what the Meuse-Argonne looked like was the grinding advance through the Argonne Forest, the daily casualties from artillery and machine guns and the accumulated diseases that the wet autumn conditions produced, the exhaustion of men who had been fighting continuously for weeks in terrain that was designed to kill them. By October, the American First Army had pushed through the main German defensive lines and was approaching the Sedan-Mézières railway, the objective whose capture would sever the German supply lines. The German army on the Western Front was collapsing, its divisions depleted, its morale broken, its strategic position untenable. On November 1st, Pershing launched the final phase of the offensive, a renewed assault that broke through the last German defenses and drove towards Sedan with a speed that surprised even the most optimistic American planners. The railway was reached. The German supply lines were cut. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice took effect. The guns fell silent across the Western Front for the first time in 4 years. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had lasted 47 days. It had involved 1.2 million American soldiers, making it the largest military operation in American history to that date. It had cost 26,277 Americans killed and 95,786 wounded. It had also broken the German army's strategic position on the Western Front and produced the conditions that made the armistice inevitable. The German commanders who reviewed the outcome of the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the months and years after the war were consistent in their assessment of what had happened. General Ludendorff, who had been the effective operational commander of the German army since 1916, wrote in his memoirs that the American assault on the Meuse-Argonne front was the decisive military event of 1918 and that the German army's inability to stop it had made the armistice unavoidable. He was right. The American army had done in 47 days what the British and French armies had spent 4 years attempting, broken through the German defensive system and created a strategic situation that Germany could not reverse. The cost had been enormous. 26,277 Americans killed in 47 days. That number represents 559 American soldiers killed every day for 47 days. It represents a casualty rate that the American public, which had been told that American entry into the war would be decisive and would end it quickly, had not been fully prepared to accept. The men who died in the Meuse-Argonne had left the United States less than 2 years earlier. Many of them had never been more than 50 miles from the towns where they were born. They had been soldiers for 18 months, civilians before that, and they had been pointed at the most formidable defensive positions in Europe and told to advance. They had advanced. Alvin York returned to Tennessee after the war and spent the rest of his life in the mountains where he had grown up, farming the land that the state of Tennessee gave him in recognition of his service, operating a school he founded for the mountain children of his county, declining most of the commercial opportunities that his fame produced because he did not believe that what he had done in the Argonne should be sold. He died in 1964, 76 years old, one of the most celebrated soldiers in American history and one of the most reluctant celebrities that American military history produced. What York represented in the story of the Meuse-Argonne was something about the American soldier at the most fundamental level, the specific quality that Pershing had been counting on when he argued for the decisive offensive, rather than the continued attrition that the British and French commands had been conducting. The quality was not invincibility. York had been afraid. The soldiers of the Lost Battalion had been afraid. The 26,277 men who died in the Argonne had been afraid. The quality was the going forward anyway. The advance into the Argonne Forest despite the 4 years of preparation that the German army had had. The holding of the pocket for 6 days without food or water. The shooting from the ravine in Tennessee mountain style because that was the only skill available and it was sufficient. That quality, multiplied by 1.2 million soldiers, had ended the First World War. The largest battle in American history was fought by civilians who had been soldiers for 18 months. They won it. That is the Meuse-Argonne. That is what 1.2 million Americans did in the autumn of 1918 in the forests and along the rivers of northeastern France. They ended the war.